Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Daled. The Mitzvah Hashem today, we will be learning Daf Reish Lamed Zayin Amud Beis. We are continuing to learn the halachas of Eruv Chatzeros. This is one of those rare times that we pick up today with the very first word of Reish Lamed Zayin Amud Beis in Siman Shin Ayin in the middle of Sif Ches by the words of the Ramah Haga. Our learning today should be a schos for Achedu Beis Yisrael, Hanasunim Batzaro Bashivya, Ha'im de Ben Bayamu Ben Bayabasha, Hamakim Yerachim Aleihim, the Eitzia Mitzar Lervacha Me'efela La'ira Mishubad L'Geula, Hashta Bagolov Zman Kariv and Namar Amen. Our learning should be a schos for Shalem and for Achia Gadol, Moshe Ben Esther Fradel, Rivka Bashir Leah Chavadasa Bas Rezel Serel, Yeshua Levi Ben Ahuva Malka Chana. They should all have a refuah shalem of B'sai Shar Chel Yisrael. Our learning should also be a schus. Rabbi Shalom should watch over all of our brothers and sisters who find themselves in harm's way. Amongst them, Yoel ben Michal, Moshe Aaron ben Zisel Udel, Ruvain Yisrael ben Tamar. The Rabbi Shalom should watch over them, protect them from any harm, together with all of our other brothers and sisters. Okay, so yesterday, in the previous year, let's put it that way, in Sif Ches, we learned the halacha of guests in a chotzer. So you have a chotzer has 10 houses in it. 8 of the houses in the chotzer have regular residents living in them, and you have 2 other houses, and now guests came for Shabbos, or guests came for a week. What's the halacha of these guests when it comes to the question of Eruve Chatzeros? Now, the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut Nun Hey on Reish Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph, already pointed out to us that this halacha is very often not going to be nageya, because remember, even if these guests stay for more than 30 days and they become considered halachically as residents of the chotzer, if there's a kehillah and there's a Rav and a Gabbai, and they went together, and they went on Erev Pesach, and they made an Eruv Chatzeros to cover the Chatzar for the entire year, well, then when they made the Eruv Chatzeros, they had in mind that even if new people move into the Chatzar over the course of the year, they should be included in the Eruv Chatzeros. So the Mishnah Berurah told us from the Taz that very often this halacha is really not so negeya. But a high level, the halacha that the Mechaber was telling us was, you have guests in a chotzer. At what point do we have to be concerned with these guests? At what point do we look at them as being bona fide residents of the chotzer, who will aser on the other bnei chotzer, and they are required to be part of the Eruv Chatzeros? And the Mechaber said that the bar is 30 days. If they're in the chotzer for less than 30 days, they're guests. We're not concerned about them. If they move into the chotzer for more than 30 days, now they become residents. Now they have to be covered by the Eruv Chatzeros. That's what we learned previously. Now we're going to see a Ramah, and the Ramah is going to make us dig a little bit deeper into the geder of precisely how this halacha works. It's a very interesting Mishnah Berurah over here, a very ambiguous, cryptic Mishnah Berurah. Let's take a look here at the Ramah. Says the Ramah, top of Reish Lamed Zayin Amud Beis, Haga. Va'afilu im ha'orchim rabim u'balabayas echad. Let's say this chotzer has one balabayas living in the chotzer. There's 10 houses, but there's one permanent resident living in there, and the other 9 are guest homes. And 9 guest families came into the chotzer, and they're going to be there for less than 30 days. But you've got 9 guest residents in the chotzer. You've got 1 balabayas. So what? Do we still look at this as being a chotzer? Well, in this case, it wouldn't need an Eruv Chatzeros at all, because there's only 1 permanent resident, and the 9 guests, if they don't aser on him, so then there's nobody asering on him. Is that the halacha? Do we look at this chotzer that has 10 families living in it for this Shabbos and say it doesn't need an Eruv Chatzeros because there's a balabayas and there's 9 guests? Says the Rambam, yeah. Afilu ma'archim rabim u'balabayas echad. We still look at it as if the guests don't count, and therefore they don't aser on the balabayas. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Kat Nun Zayin. Va'afilu im ha'archim rabim nami betelim. The guests are negated. They're bottled. Nami betelim legabe balabayas. They're bottled to the balabayas. V'nasim ka'anshe beisoi. That's the ambiguous cryptic piece of this Mishnah Berurah. V'nasim ka'anshe beisoi. We look at the 9 guests as being part of the Balabayas' home. And therefore it's all one entity, and you don't need an Eruv Chatzeres. Now, it's very tempting to read these words in the Mishnah Berurah and think that what the Mishnah Berurah means is that, well, the guests are an extension of the Balabayas. They're part of the Balabayas' home. If there's only one Balabayas in the Chotzer, so now there's only one entity in the Chotzer, you don't need an Eruv Chatzeres. Let's say there are 2 Balabatim in the Chotzer, 2 permanent residents in the Chotzer, so you do need an Eruv Chatzeres, and you have 8 guests. Well, somehow now the 8 guests are an extension of either the 2 permanent residents in the Chotzer or one of the permanent residents in the Chotzer, so they're covered by the Eruv Chatzeres. This is kind of like what the Mishnah Berurah sounds like. But if you go down that path of thought, then the conclusion you would reach is that there has to be some kind of connection between the guests and the Balabatim. So if it's pshat that you have 2 permanent residents in the Chotzer, Reuven and Shimon, and Reuven invited all of his first cousins to the Chotzer for Shabbos, so the 8 other guests in the Chotzer are Reuven's guests, so then, okay, then I could understand that there's some level of connection between Reuven and the 8 guests. The 8 guests are an extension of Reuven. Or even, let's say Reuven owns the other houses in the Chotzer that the 8 guests are staying in. So, okay, again, there's some kind of connection between Reuven and the guests. Maybe we could negate the guests. We could be mavatal the guests, legabe Reuven. But again, there's some kind of connection. But it's very clear from the Biur Halacha, Dibur HaMaschil, Kavua, that that's not the Geder. That's not what's going on here. We're not looking at the guests as being extensions of a permanent resident that they have some kind of connection to. The Biur Halacha actually bavarns this issue in a certain way. Says the Chavetz Chaim in the Biur Halacha, Dibur HaMaschil Kavua, Ayin b'Trumas Hadeshen. Take a look at the Trumas Hadeshen. Umuchach Sham, it's very clear from the Trumas Hadeshen. Da afilu ha'archim misarchim b'batim she'enam shayachim lahai balabayas ha'kavua sheyesham. The houses that the guests are living in have nothing to do with the permanent resident that's living in the Chotzer. You have an Eina Yehudi who owns 8 Airbnbs inside this Chotzer. And it's a very nice location, and it's during the summer, and 8 Yiddish guests came, and they rented 8 Airbnbs from Tony, the Eina Yehudi, who lives 50 miles away. There's no shaykhis to Reuven. So you have Reuven and Shimon, our permanent residents in this lovely Chotzer. You've got 8 Airbnbs that are owned by Tony. Now you've got 8 Yiddish families who rented out the 8 Airbnbs from Tony, and they're there for Shabbos. So now somehow they're tuffle to Reuven and Shimon, Nasim Ka'anshe Beisai. They become like extensions of Reuven and Shimon. How would that be? And the Biur Halacha continues. He says, "Afilu hachi amrinan de ha'archim nitfalin legabe abalabayis shedar b'chatzer b'kvius ve'eno iser alav." Even though these 8 families have no shaykhis to Reuven and Shimon, they are still tuffle to the permanent residents, to Reuven and Shimon, who live in the Chotzer, and therefore eno iser alav. Therefore, they do not aser on them. So again, when I first was learning this halacha, the simplest way to look at this would have been that, okay, you're in the Chotzer for less than 30 days, you're not considered a resident of the Chotzer. You're living there for Shabbos? Yeah, but you're not a resident. We don't have to take you into consideration. We don't have to look at you halachically as being a separate entity, and therefore this is a Chotzer that's serving more than one entity, and it needs an Eruv Chatzeres. No, you're a guest. We don't look at you as being there. But that's not where we're going. Where we seem to be going based on Mishnah Berurah's Katan on Zion is that, no, you are there. I mean, physically you're there for Shabbos. Those 8 families are located in the Chotzer. So factually, the facts on the ground are that for this Shabbos, it would seem that the Chotzer is serving more than one entity. We can't just completely negate you and say that because they're there for less than 30 days, they don't exist. They do exist, right? So halachically, how are we the word that's coming to my mind is disposing of them. Halachically, how are we negating them, halachically, and saying that they don't make us require an Eruv Chatzeros? Says the Mishnah Berurah, the answer is because somehow they become bottle to the permanent residents that are in the Chatzar. Why do they become bottle to them if they have nothing to do with them? And I think the feeling that I'm getting over here, and from looking around and seeing the way other people write about this, the feeling that I'm getting is it's not so much that they are bottle to the permanent residents, as much as when we look at this chutzner from 30,000 feet, how do we look at the chutzner? And I think when you have guests that are there for less than 30 days, when we look at this chutzner, and we see Reuben and Shimon, permanent residents of the Chatzar, and 8 other families that are guests that are going to be there for less than 30 days, they're bottled to the permanent residents, means that we look at this Chatzar and we say, oh, this Chatzar is Reuben and Shimon. How about them? How about the other 8 guests? No. We're going to call this Chatzar a Chatzar of Reuben and Shimon because they're the permanent residents. We're not going to call it a chutzner of Reuben and Shimon and 8 other families. There's 8 other families there. Yes, but once there are, a thought, I always think that this is the siyata d'shmaya of giving a shir. I'm going to give you a funny analogy, and it's an analogy maybe that, nowadays the younger chevra in the world that we live in nowadays, maybe it doesn't resonate as much, but for the older chevra, I think it will resonate. Lahavdal elef alfei avdolos. You have a shopping mall, a good old-fashioned shopping mall. So shopping malls were always designed that they had big anchor stores, big box anchor stores. So let's say you have a shopping mall. It's got, on one side, it's got a Macy's. On the other side, I'm going to say a Sears, right? What's Sears? Who's that? I don't know what I could replace Sears with nowadays. I don't know what big box stores are left. But in the olden days, you had a Macy's on one side of the mall, you had a Sears on the other side of the mall. Those were the anchor stores of the mall. Then going in the shopping mall between the Macy's and the Sears, you had 70 little stores that the mall stores would come and they would rent out stores. But the anchor stores, meaning the ikker of the mall, was the Macy's and the Sears. The little stores that rented out the 70 stores between Macy's and Sears, they relied on the attraction of Macy's and Sears to bring people to the shopping mall. Once people are in the shopping mall, they'll come by them also. But the thought process always was that nobody's coming to the mall just for one of those little stores. The ikker is they're coming from Macy's, they're coming to Sears, especially if they need one thing from Macy's and they need one thing from Sears, they're going to walk into Macy's, buy what they need from Macy's, walk through the mall to get to Sears, and they'll stop by 3 stores in the middle. My point is that very often people would refer to the mall and they would say, the Macy's and Sears mall, or the Macy's mall, or the Sears mall. They didn't call it the I don't know even nowadays. When I think of mall stores, I'm going back 20 years, Radio Shack. How long have they been out of business, right? But nobody's, or those little kiosks that they have, scattered throughout the mall. People aren't really coming for the kiosks. They're coming for the big stores. That's what they're coming for. Same thing over here. When we look at this chutzner, we have Reuben and Shimon that are permanent residents in the chutzner. When we look at this halachically, we see a Reuben and Shimon chutzner. There's 8 other families who rented out Airbnbs from Tony. Yeah, they're there. But the chutzner is not nikreis al shmam. We don't call the chutzner, we don't consider the chutzner halachically by them. They're ki'ilu, they're loy nechshav. They're loy nechshav l'klum. They're not considered that they're really there because they're not bona fide residents. They're not permanent residents. I think that's all the Mishnah Berurah means when he says, now, you could quibble with me because v'nasim ka'anshe beisai, they're made like members of their house. Again, I don't think that is to be taken literally, and the Mishnah Berurah doesn't seem to be pulling that lashon from anybody. There's no ois cotton in the Sharetzion over here, I didn't see yet anywhere that Chavetz Chaim would be pulling those exact words from. It seems to be his own words. But again, the Biur Halacha sheds light on what the Chavetz Chaim is thinking. So I don't think Nasim K'anshe Beisai, maybe what Nasim K'anshe Beisai means is, again, if you would push somebody into a corner and say, but Rabbi, those 8 families, they are there. Yeah, they're there. They're in Reuven and Shimon's Chatzar. They're not in their Chatzar. It's not their Chatzar. Well, you're going to say that this Chatzar is Levi, Yehuda, Dan, and Naphtali's Chatzar? No, it's not. They're transient. They're here today, gone tomorrow. It's Reuven and Shimon's Chatzar. That's what it means, Nasim K'anshe Beisai. Now, at one point, I was digging into this a little deeper, and I was thinking to myself, maybe Nasim K'anshe Beisai means that they go after the owner of the home that they're living in. And I started to do the math. Let's say they're renting from Tony. So, okay, so now they're Nasim K'anshe Beisai of Tony. Is Tony going to aser on the other Bnei HaChatzar? No. Tony's an Ein Yehudi who lives somewhere else. He's not there. So in the context of Reuven Chatzeros, Tony's homes are considered empty diras because, what do you mean? Tony's not there for Shabbos. Tony's far away. He doesn't live here, right? So, okay, there are 8 families living there now. Yeah, but they're extensions of Tony, and Tony doesn't exist. Let's say a Yid owns the 8 houses. Okay, he's not in the Chutzner. And obviously he rented out his homes to 8 other families for Shabbos. He's Mesiach Das. He's not coming home for Shabbos. So again, he's not there. Nasim K'anshe Beisai. But I don't think that that's what the Mishnah Berurah means. And the reason I don't think he means that is because of the next halacha that we're going to learn in the Ramah. Let's go weiter in the Ramah. Says the Ramah, V'dafka b'de'ika balabayas echad kavua. The only time we could apply this halacha and we could say that the guests that are there for less than 30 days don't count, the only time we could say that is if there is a permanent resident, at least one permanent resident, who's home in the Chatzar. V'dafka b'de'ika balabayas echad kavua, da'oz ha'archib b'telim legabei. See, this is where the Mishnah Berurah is coming from. Da'oz ha'archib b'telim legabei. That's when we could say that the guests are bottle to the anchor of the Chatzar, when the Chatzar has an anchor. If the Chatzar has at least one permanent resident that's living there, then we could look at this Chatzar as being Reuven's Chatzar, and we could be Mavatal, the guests. But, says the Mishnah Berurah, the Ramah, Aval Orchim b'yachad, but let's say you have a Chatzar that only has guests in it, right? This is a beautiful Chatzar, that's 10 Airbnbs. There's no permanent resident to the Chatzar. So the only ones that are there are 10 guests. That's all that's there. Aval archib b'yachad oisrim zal zeh miyad. 10 guests come and rent out those 10 Airbnbs in that Chatzar for Shabbos. They got to make it a Reuven Chatzeros right away. They're guests in the Chatzar. Yeah. But now, how are you going to look at this Chatzar? When there's a permanent resident of the Chatzar, Reuven's a permanent resident of the Chatzar, you could look and you could say it's Reuven's Chatzar, everybody else is bottled to Reuven. But if there's no Reuven, if there is no permanent resident in the Chatzar, then when you look at this Chatzar, the only choice that you have is to call it the Chatzar of the guests. And if it's the Chatzar of the guests, well, the guests are independent entities, and you needed a Reuven Chatzeros. So it would be like the shopping mall without the Macy's and the Sears. You have a mall that's only individual stores. So what are you going to call it? You're going to call it, you know, that funny mall that only has small stores. So when you look at this Chatzar, you can't call it Reuven's Chatzar. There's no Reuven. You have to look at it as being the Chatzar of the guests. So now you're machshiv the guests. Now you're taking the guests into consideration. Well, if you take the guests into consideration, they're separate entities. They aser on each other. They needed a Reuven Chatzeros, and they needed a Reuven Chatzeros miyad. Immediately they needed a Reuven Chatzeros. Even if they're only going to be there for one Shabbos, they needed a Reuven Chatzeros. Finishing off the Siman, the Ramah says, Ayin l'kavan soif Siman shin tzadik aleph. Sif Beis, where there's more details about this. Va'akum emisarech al kaman siman shin pei daled, where we talk about what happens when an Eina Yehudi is a guest in a chotzer. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut nun ches aval orcha biyachad v'tzayin loyme shelo yahayu sham rak orcha b'chotzer. If you have a chotzer that only has guests in it, u'mari b'sheish chalechad cheda b'yuchad la'achila k'mash kasa sif gimel. The only time the guests are going to need an Eruv Chatzeros is if they're all eating on their own, so they're considered separate entities. Now there's no resident kavua who could be the anchor of the chotzer, so that it would be his chotzer. Have a kishar balabatim. So now these guests are the balabatim of the chotzer. So they ask around each other. Now, the Mishnah Berurah says, this whole discussion is only germane when we're looking at one chotzer in a vacuum. But let's say you have a city, and the city has multiple chatzeros. There's other chatzeros that have Yid living in them. And all of the chatzeros have been joined together in the shetufei mevuos. Then beteli hani archim legabi shar balabatim klum shebeir. Right? Let's say you have a city. The city has 10 chatzeros in it. 9 chatzeros are regular chatzeros that each one has multiple yidden living in it. And now you have one chatzer in the city that has 10 homes and it's all guests. There's no balabayas. So does that chatzer need a separate Eruv Chatzeros? No, because it's joined together with all of the other chatzeros in the city. It's joined in a shetufei mevuos. So then they're covered by the shetufei mevuos. The ir shasuya b'tiket mevuos kadin hi chashuva kula kechatzer achas v'chanal, because the shetufei mevuos joined everybody into one big unit. If the chotzer is only guests, they answer on each other. Let's say you have a chotzer that has 10 Airbnbs. Again, let's say our case of Tony, the Eina Yehudi, who owns 10 Airbnbs in a chotzer. So maybe the chotzer has 11 homes. Tony lives in one, and then he has another 10 that he rents out as Airbnbs. So now the guests come, and they're living in the Airbnbs, and then there's Tony, right? So now they're going to have to be maskir rishus from Tony. They're going to have to give Tony $1 and rent out his rishus so that he could join them in the Eruv Chatzeros. Now, the case that I gave, you'll have questions about what if Tony has a tfisas yad in the other units because he owns the furniture in the other units. Okay. Ice cotton. Samachal miyad, they'll answer right away on each other. Hainu afilum shavsu rak Shabbos hakas. They would answer on each other right away, these guests, even if it's only for one Shabbos. Okay, I think we might break our record. We're going to stop over here. We'll continue next time with Siman Shin and Aleph. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Listen to limud HaTorah should be Megan against Klal Yisrael. The Ramah Shem should send Yeshua Refuas Parnasa Shaduchim to all those in need. We should be zeichet to see the Bias called Tzedek B'mher V'Yameinu. Amen. Be well.